truck base, you'll win the race.
You're listening to Trucking Tomorrow, your go-to podcast for exploring and understanding the future of trucking from a carrier's perspective. In each episode, we sit down with industry veterans to discuss what it takes to grow your trucking company in today's world. So let's hit the road with Trucking Tomorrow. Here's your host, Brian Jones.
Welcome to Trucking Tomorrow, presented by TruckBase, where we tell the stories of trucking industry leaders and talk about everything coming up in the trucking world, from operations to technology to policy. I'm your host, Brian Jones, and I'm grateful to be joined today by Ben Greenberg, the President and CEO of North Carolina Trucking Association. Ben, welcome. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. I've been looking forward to this conversation, and I know we've spoken before. I'm familiar with the NCTA, but just as we kick things off, can you tell our listeners a little bit about what the NCTA is, what you guys do?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been around since 1929, and we are the state-level trucking association for North Carolina, part of a federation with 49 other state trucking associations that roll up to the American Trucking Associations. In North Carolina, we kind of put all of our programming into what I generally refer to as three buckets, whether it's advocacy, education, and promotion of the industry.
Awesome. And the primary mission that you guys have, what's your reason for being? I know you guys are a nonprofit, right? So what's your mission?
Yeah, we're the voice of the trucking industry in North Carolina. And so we look to advocate, promote, and educate a safe and sustainable trucking industry in North Carolina and abroad.
And how is this structured? And forgive me, because this is some of it's maybe NCTA specific, but everyone has their own state level association. So a lot of our partners may not be in North Carolina, but are still curious how this machinery works. But can you talk through the structure of the NCTA?
Yeah.
What it looks like?
Sure. So we're governed by a board of directors that's made up of about 40 or so companies, motor carriers and allied members, allied being companies like TruckBase and other companies that provide supplies and services to the industry. So think, legal, technology, insurance, tires, trucks, et cetera. Anything you can think that a trucking company might need, our allied members provide. We're core, our motor carriers, of course, and they make up our board of directors, which then passes on power to our executive committee, which is made up of 9 member companies, one being the chair, and they kind of rotate through. It's either a 5 or 7 year process where they're kind of in charge for the day-to-day operations of the association. And then that bubbles down to the staff level, where you've got myself and 4 other full-time staff members, 1 part-time regulatory specialist. And then the bulk of our work gets done by our committees and councils. That's all member volunteer led, that cover all of our programming that we handle and all of the various councils that we support within the association.
Awesome. Very cool. And on those programs and councils, what are some examples? What programs do you guys run? Are there some that are more significant than others in terms of how much effort and kind of the size they are?
Yeah, absolutely. So our newest and fastest growing council is our Women in Trucking Council. They were formed in our spring board meeting officially in 2023. It kind of existed, but it wasn't really a part of our formal bylaws. It's just kind of grown since then. When we just recently came off our 3rd annual Women in Trucking Summit, which we held in Wilmington, North Carolina, had about 150 female trucking executives there, working on industry information updates, empowerment, and breaking down barriers in what is traditionally a male-dominated industry. So that's the Women in Trucking Council. We've also got technology and maintenance and safety and human resources, but those have been around for quite some time. And you can imagine the type of programming that they put on more specific to their industry groups. And they all bubble up to our councils conference, which is where all of our councils combine together. And that'll be in October of this year. And then our other big events that we do is our NCTA management conference, which will be in July. That's where all of our executives get together for education and networking with all of the leaders within our state on the motor carrier side and the allied side. And then we also have a truck driving championship and Top Tech Challenge, which will be coming up in June. Just as it sounds, we've got our drivers, best of the best, and technicians competing for first place in their categories. At the tech side, we've got students and professional technicians that are competing. And then on the driver's side, we've got them divided up amongst their 9 classes of vehicle operation. And the winners of that event will actually go and compete expense paid at the national level with the American Trucking Associations for the Super Tech and then the National Truck Driving Championship. And then mixed in, kind of sprinkled in between, we have all sorts of workshops, webinar series, advocacy events at the General Assembly. And then we have a Call on Washington, which is a once-a-year event where we get our member base to go up and meet with their elected official in D.C.
Sounds like you have a busy schedule on your hands, Ben. There's a lot of things going on there.
Yeah, there's quite a lot. And we wouldn't be able to do any of it without our member support. So really, they're the workers, and we're so thankful for their volunteer time and hours they put in just to make the programming happen, get the ideas out there, and then also just to get the word out, because in this day and age, it's increasingly challenging to get folks' attention to make sure that they've got the information in front of them to make an informed decision on whether to attend and put hours and resources towards an event.
As your role as leading the organization, and you're one of the few full-time employees of the organization, what is your role exactly there, given how many things you have in the fire, so to speak, within the NCTA?
Yeah, it's very analogous to a small trucking company in the sense that, one person's wearing many hats, right? So, chief legal officer, IT officer, HR officer, advocate, a little bit of everything. And that's, frankly, kind of one of the more exciting things about the job is that every day is different. Today, for example, woke up this morning to a tragedy in Maryland. It was the first news story that I saw with the bridge collapse after the carrier ship struck it. And I had an idea of what my day was going to look like, and that changed pretty quickly in terms of getting information out about truck routes from my counterpart in Maryland to our membership about how to navigate with that part of 695 being shut down, and then was fielding various interview requests just to go provide some commentary on the potential impact for truckers across the country and in North Carolina specifically. So every day is a little bit different, but it's a fun job, and it's just something that it's really valuable just to give back to the industry that's given me and my family so much.
Totally. Well, I know we're talking about the North Carolina Trucking Association. You have counterparts in other states. It rolls up to the American Trucking Associations. Could you share, to your knowledge, how similar or different your structure is in North Carolina compared to other states? And I know you have a lot of counterparts you're connected with.
Sure.
Love to.
Yeah, I think every state has sort of its core competencies, and then there's some differences, right? And I think most of our state trucking associations are member-led. And so the programming naturally is made up of the type of fleets that you have. North Carolina had a lot of fleets, and they're by no means a monolith, right? So, most of them are hauling general commodities. We're all over the place. We're not just super heavy in one particular industry. And so as a result, it tends to result in a sort of a broad wavelength of programming because we've got folks with different niches. For example, we have a really strong core group of folks that are in the construction industry. And so they're hauling heavy equipment over dimensional large loads, and they have particular needs with state DOT and the permitting office and potential regulatory changes. So we've got a very niche, super focused group that meets with DOT quarterly on that. Where, say in other states, like, maybe in the Midwest, where you might be a little bit more heavy in a particular area, whether it's ag or something else, that programming is just going to be a little bit different. But I would say the core, we're all about safety. Everybody's trying to continue to promote a safe and stable transportation infrastructure throughout the country. And things might be a little bit different just based off where, your needs are. Another example is you can look at, say, California or Texas. Those are going to be some of our much larger state trucking associations, Florida as well. California is very hot and heavy involved in the energy space because that's where a lot of that policy is being driven right now. And so they're actually involved in litigation on CARB and what they're working on out there with ACT and advanced clean fleets. So it really just depends on what's going on in any particular state at one given time on what their priorities are. But we all work really well together. It's a large dysfunctional family of folks that kind of get together, all working towards one mission, really, of just promoting the industry and making it as stable and as safe and hopefully a little profitable as well as possible.
Awesome. You hinted at the policy side of that, and I want to get into that a little bit because we talked about operations, technology, and policy, and where you sit really spikes on the policy side relative to other folks we've had on the show here. But wanted to hear, in your words, how you think about influencing versus educating. I know we've talked about that previously in some of our conversations, but What role do you see the NCTA playing in policymaking in that regard?
Yeah, sure. So I've thought a little bit about this question, having heard it before. And my goal is that education and influence is one and the same when it comes to the North Carolina Trucking Association. We're always advocating with facts. And, by educating folks, that tends to shape and influence policy, right? And so, I'm a lawyer by trade. I did that for 10 years. And one of my law professors artfully said one time, if you've got the facts, argue the facts. If you've got the law, argue the table, argue the law. And if you have neither, bang the table, right? And so we're in a situation where thankfully we've got a lot of great organizations behind us from a fact standpoint, one of them being ATRI, the American Transportation Research Institute. And they've been around for a long time, a nonprofit. And they get us all the facts that we need to make the appropriate advocacy arguments. And so by educating our members of Congress or our state delegations, we are able to influence at the same time, which is frankly a fun part about the job for me coming from a legal background, is that I'm not having to come up with arguments that I don't stand by myself because they're all fact-based. And it's nice that our issues don't tend to necessarily have an R beside them or a D beside them, when we're in this hyperbolic, partisan situation that we're in both in Congress and sometimes at the state level as well. It's nice just to be able to talk with folks on one side of the aisle and the other side of the aisle. And if you got the facts behind you, believe it or not, common sense does tend to prevail.
Yeah. You mentioned ATRI as a good resource. And for folks who aren't familiar, could you share what ATRI is and maybe an example of how you've used that to kind of pull back the conversation?
Sure. I hope I get the state right or Rebecca will come after me, but they've been around since the 1950s, and they're similarly sort of a member-led, stakeholder-led research arm that will investigate and put facts and data behind anything that the transportation industry is having research on. And so they've put together some great studies on things like energy impact of trying to electrify trucks, predatory towing and its impact on the industry, the costs of congestion, research on the investments that trucking companies have made across the country in safety. They do an annual operational cost of trucking report, which is great from a benchmarking standpoint for fleets to be able to look at their data. Unfortunately, the cost of trucking keeps going up, and that's something that it's important for fleets to be able to try to be as efficient as possible. And you start by looking at your data and getting those benchmarking points. And so you can get cost per mile, cost per hour on an annual basis, just to be able to compare your specific niche and region of the country to get an idea. And the beauty behind that is you're getting data from a wide variety of fleets, and it's all aggregated and then sliced and diced and made confidential. So it can really be relied on as a kind of a benchmark for what it costs to operate a truck in this environment. And, unfortunately, the rates that some shippers are offering just don't justify the cost of actually moving the truck. And so I think you're seeing that a little bit in the current freight economy, but the data is just invaluable for us. And then they also help us put together some specific state fast facts to help us at our state level to be able to educate our elected officials on the impact of trucking and transportation in each of our 50 states.
Awesome. Yeah. I know a lot of our carrier partners use the ATRI benchmarks for cost per mile as just a standard, right? It's really practical, but you guys obviously use it for more than that when you're talking about where you guys plug in here.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it seems like it's once a week or once a month, a new report's coming out that's just helpful to inform the greater conversation about the supply chain and how we can make it stronger.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, would love to hear maybe one or two priorities that's on your list right now at the NCTA. What are you working on? What's top of mind? And this might be North Carolina specific, but what's in the conversation this year for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're working on a couple of projects right now. We're in the short session at our General Assembly. So we go short session, long session. We had a very successful long session in 2023. And with the short session and it being an election year, you're never really sure how long our elected officials are going to be in Raleigh and what will actually get done. But we are working on a couple of initiatives in the short session, potential bills that might get passed. One is in that heavy haul space where we're looking at some niche reform on pilot car credentialing to assist overdimensional carriers to be able to have those flagger vehicles that are necessary to be able to assist them in doing their work, and also modernize some of the statutes and regulations that apply to pilot car drivers. Unfortunately, law doesn't keep up with the change in technology. And an easy example there is just our general work trucks have gotten heavier, right? So, you look at a Ford or a Dodge, those trucks are just getting bigger, 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 and heavier. And it's just not keeping up with what our DOT and State Highway Patrol are enforcing for pilot car dimensions. So we're working on some reasonable reform in that space. And predatory towing, that's something else that's popped up. That's been a big issue. It's being covered in the media coming out of the Charlotte area with just how North Carolina is, to use their tagline, a little bit of the wild, wild west when it comes to a regulatory environment in towing. And so we are looking at what some reasonable reform would look like in that space, just to provide some predictability and consistency across all 100 counties in North Carolina. So folks are kind of aware of what a maximum rate might be, what payments have to be accepted, timelines for returning cargo, which could be, a very sensitive load, and in that area as well. And so we're hoping to be able to move forward with some bipartisan support for some reasonable reform in that space that honors and respects the very legitimate towing and recovery companies that exist and the services that they provide, which is an essential service, but also put some guardrails in place for some of the bad actors that unfortunately have been attracted to the industry by a lack of regulation. So those are two real hot issues. And then we're working on some reform as we get into 2025 in a variety of areas, but that's all kind of driven by our legislative committee. So they'll vote on their legislative priorities, and that bubbles up to our board of directors and are usually looked at and approved based off of what that committee supported. And so we've got a list of, say, 7 or 9 different priorities that we're paying attention to at any given time and ready to act on. But it's just a matter of, what's hot at the moment, and then frankly, what has the opportunity to move, because we're interested in getting things done. My counterpart at the ATA, Chris Spear, says it best. We're not intending to be a country club. There's plenty of organizations where you can pay your dues and, get a sticker in the mail, but that's really not what we're about. We're about getting things done. And sometimes that takes a pragmatic approach to taking a look at your priorities and seeing what has the right momentum behind it to potentially get across that finish line, depending on what type of session you're in.
Got it. Well, you mentioned a couple of priorities there. You mentioned the legislative committee. A lot of our partners and listeners are carriers, they're fleet owners, and would love to hear how their voice gets into this part of the conversation. Because in some ways, the NCTA is a conduit. It's a channel for voices to be heard. So how does an issue elevate its way to your desk? And then how do you engage with the carrier community to then kind of bring that to the legislative body? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so it's all driven by our legislative committee, which is made up of volunteers like all of our committees. So anybody can raise their hand and raise an issue. And if we start hearing consensus that this is an issue, then it comes up for a policy vote. And once something is voted from a policy standpoint out of our legislative committee, it would go up to our board of directors for approval. And then that's our directive, right? And so we're member led. And so it's not a matter of me coming up with what I think is best for transportation in North Carolina. It's driven by our member fleets, whether they're domiciled in North Carolina or whether they just have significant operations in North Carolina. Anybody is able to come to the table and offer up policy suggestions, and they're taken very seriously. And that's what guides our priorities for the association.
Awesome. We like to talk about how things are developing, but we can look back and see results as well. And so I'm curious if you have any examples of, policy decisions that maybe didn't have all the data and where the NCTA really played a role in informing the decision by kind of bringing voices and data to the table for some decisions or a policy that was made. Do you have any kind of backward-facing examples of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we just came out of a long session and we had what I would refer to as 3 sort of priority wins in that session. One was in the workers' compensation space, which is pretty niche. One was in the infrastructure space, which is dollars for roads and bridges. And then the main focus on those. And the last one was in energy, which was essentially informing and educating our legislators why the industry is not ready to move forward with some of the aggressive and frankly impossible timelines coming out of California. And so I can hit them in those three orders just to touch on them real quick. The first was niche. Like I said, it was workers' compensation. We had a bad Court of Appeals decision that came out interpreting a law that was passed in 2011 through an industry coalition to put reasonable caps on workers' compensation benefits to essentially incentivize workers to return to work. So you give someone 9.5 years after a work injury to heal, medically speaking, to get any type of retraining that they want, and then return to a job in some form or fashion, with exceptions for the most extreme cases where somebody is just not able to return to work in any form or fashion. And our Court of Appeals, in my humble opinion, got it wrong and interpreted that law and that cap that was put in place and essentially judicially overturned that cap. And so all of a sudden, we were left in the situation that even the most minor workplace injuries could turn into a lifetime claim, which really disrupts the incentives for having folks reasonably return to work or get retrained in some fashion. And so the NCTA, through its regularly scheduled legislative advocacy at the General Assembly, was scheduled to be there, I think the day or two after that decision was actually dropped. And we were able to mobilize incredibly quickly, get some white paper information on that, and just update our elected officials in a space that, frankly, most of them knew nothing about just because of how niche it was and just how the legislative process works, where, in North Carolina, everybody's reelected every 2 years, and it's a part-time job. People probably don't realize it, but our elected officials have a salary of about $14,000 a year. So naturally, they have real jobs, right? Just to be able to afford rent or bills in any one of our counties. And so they come to the General Assembly with their industry background, their experience, and they can come from all different types of fields, but not a lot of folks are going to have that type of detailed experience on a niche workers' compensation issue that was passed in 2011. And you can kind of look around the room and realize that not many people, if any, that were a part of that reform when it was passed in 2011 are still at the General Assembly today. And so it was a big educational effort just to indicate what sort of impact that would have on all industries. Trucking, frankly, being the most impacted just because we pay so well in our industry for folks that, from a barrier to entry, really don't have to have a lot of education to come in. You have a lot of folks that might have their GED or might have some high school that are able to earn, well into six figures for their job. And so we have a lot of exposure with workers' comp, but we were able to get a bill passed in the budget to be able to put that cap back in place. So we basically said, no Court of Appeals, you got this one wrong. Legislatively, we're going to put this cap back into effect to stop the pain that would be coming down the road from having an unregulated workers' comp industry. So that was one issue. The other big one that popped up had to do with infrastructure funding, where North Carolina operates on a 10-year plan. That's what we generally work on. And we're about $8 billion underfunded with highway funds for that plan. And so good intentioned members of our General Assembly were looking at ways of raising funds for that, knowing that a lot of that money comes from the fuel tax. And so you've got passenger vehicles that are becoming more efficient at a rapidly increasing pace, right? If you look around Raleigh, for example, you're seeing a lot of electric vehicles, you're seeing hybrid vehicles. And so they're simply just not putting as much money into that tax at the pump. And so you're seeing these shortfalls. And unfortunately, it's not a very popular issue to say, hey, raise the fuel tax, right? That's something that the industry has been advocating for a long time. Just simply raise it, tie it to inflation, and it will shore things up for a little while. And the reason we like that tax is because it's incredibly efficient, where you've got 99 cents on the dollar that's actually going to roads and bridges where our professional drivers, that's their office space. And so we like it because it's incredibly efficient. Your fleets are able to pass that cost along appropriately. Everyone understands the cost. It's very efficient. But when you've got a shortfall, you're looking for other ways of raising money. And one idea that came up in the long session that was potentially going to be in the budget was to look at the tax that motor carriers pay in North Carolina when you register a vehicle. You've got a 12% tax that you pay at the federal level, and then you've got a 3% tax that you pay at the state level, but it's capped at $2,000 in North Carolina. And so one idea was to just eliminate that cap. And so all of a sudden you're looking at what a $2,000 bill would be. And if you eliminate that cap, you're potentially looking at a $6,000 vehicle. So a $4,000 delta on each power unit. That's a huge increase in tax. And again, this problem was generated by passenger vehicles becoming more efficient, right? And so North Carolina motor carriers are already paying, close to $1 billion in taxes every year for roads and bridges. The shortfall is not coming from them. There's not a lot of electric trucks running around that aren't, paying as much at the wholesale rack. So the issue and how we were able to educate our General Assembly is to provide them with that real-time information on what really happens to a small fleet when you take their power unit registration tax and increase it by $4,000 per unit in a short time period. That would be devastating. And it was beautiful in the sense that that bill got filed. And again, the following day, based off of a previously scheduled advocacy event, we had our Women in Trucking Council show up and fill up a conference room. So we had 35 female trucking executives at the General Assembly telling their stories about how small businesses would be impacted by a 200 to 300% increase in tax on a per power unit basis, that fleets would be making decisions about, do I even upgrade my equipment? Do I put the latest and greatest safety technology on it? These are all decisions that a fleet has to make when margins are so thin, right? A lot of these fleets are spending $1, hoping to make a nickel on it. And so if you increase that tax by that percent, they're going to have to make some really hard decisions about whether to even purchase new equipment. And then that comes with all the safety enhancements, the environmental enhancements, et cetera. And we were able to have that meeting at the General Assembly. Those stories got picked up and actually relayed at the Senate Transportation Committee hearing. And that language was successfully killed on the budget. And in its place, there was some increase in taxes on electric vehicle registration and then also on ride shares, which it's an area of revenue that hadn't really been looked at to kind of help offset those $8 billion in roads and bridges promises that weren't being met. So that was a great advocacy win. It was all driven by our Women in Trucking Council, who was able to show up and just get their stories told. And then the last bit was the energy policy coming from California, where our General Assembly was looking to further align North Carolina, believe it or not, with advanced clean trucks, which is the policy that would require an OEM to be selling a higher percentage of electric vehicles. And it's not because NC truckers are against clean air for our kids and grandkids. It's just the technology's not there yet, and it's not viable yet for the majority of use cases that would make it practical. I think ATRI just put out a study where it was the Clean Freight Coalition, and it's going to cost about $1 trillion to upgrade the infrastructure to be able to make electric trucks feasible, with about 2/3 of that coming from fleets having to upgrade their yards to be able to charge, and then a third coming from utilities just to be able to upgrade their grids to be able to handle all of the extra strain that all these commercial trucks would have from a charging standpoint. And so again, we were able to start a very robust telephone tree on the eve of the budget being passed. And we got a lovely text message from the Speaker of the House's office that said, "Hey, the truckers have won, please stop calling." And so we were able to get that language taken out of the budget and get some language put in that stopped a governor or the Department of Environmental Quality from further aligning us with policy that's coming from California that's just not practical at the current time. So we're really excited about all those wins. It was fun to have that quick success for our members, but it wouldn't have been possible without their stories.
Yeah. I really like the example of the fuel tax versus the capital outlay tax when you're purchasing a new power unit, because it's really educating legislators on how the industry works, because different tax structures also has implications for what you can reasonably pass through into your cost of operating. And it's just hard to communicate capital investments, but it's much easier to communicate, variable expenses that, are there's indices for this that are built into billing structures, and then it's more evenly shared, right? Versus something that is kind of hard to communicate, I guess.
Yeah. And those stories is what works, right? That was the beauty of it. And, me being a registered lobbyist for this job, making those arguments doesn't matter to an elected official and shouldn't matter. What really matters is hearing from folks that are in the trenches doing this on a day-to-day basis. And that's the beauty of storytelling and getting members that are fired up and willing to, give some time to make a huge difference.
Yeah. So we're talking a lot about policy here. And there's a lot of reasons why carriers might get involved with their state level association. And we talked about this when we were at an event together in North Carolina earlier this year, but would love to get your perspective on why carriers get plugged into their state associations, because it might be policy, but there's other factors as well here.
Yeah, I would say it's kind of a buffet on motivations for fleets. Some of them just do it because they want to participate in our truck driving championship. And that's okay. That's a good reason to be involved with the State Trucking Association. From my side of the house, I always want more, right? I want more engagement, and I'm competitive by nature. And so the biggest prize for me is advocacy wins. And we only get those through that storytelling and having a bigger tent, a bigger coalition. And there's plenty of folks that get that and make it a regular part of their job. But I think there's plenty of folks that see that as something that's too far off, too distant. They don't think government works for them. But the reality is, at the state level, you can get involved really quickly and have a major impact almost, within months. And that's completely different than what you see in Congress, right? Where we've had essentially the least productive Congress in, I feel like, decades in terms of what's actually getting done. Again, with it being an election year and just the partisanship that's happening there. At the state level, you make a good, compelling story, things happen really quickly. And so if you're impatient and you like winning, getting involved at the state level is something that any fleet can put a little bit of time to and see a real reward. And then also, something I say, joking with members or prospects, that you also buy your ticket to be able to complain, right? If you're not willing to put in the work, you're not willing to show up, in my humble opinion, you're not able to complain about bad policy in your state. If you're not willing to make a difference. And in North Carolina, the beauty of it is you go and you fight, and you might lose, but that's okay, because every 2 years there's a new slate of folks to go make for. So it's a quick reset. It's another opportunity to go try something different. And so that's, a big push from my side. But apart from, say advocacy or the truck driving championship, safety and human resource training is a big issue, right? And so we're able to build great relationships with our state highway patrol, FMCSA, DOT, and help our members facilitate positive relationships with some of those enforcement agencies. So, hopefully, there's no enforcement, but if there is enforcement, it's not the best time to advocate your position when you're pulled over on the side of the road, right? But, we've got member stories where folks are able to build that rapport and that relationship with enforcement agencies and get a better understanding of what they're looking for, and hopefully avoid enforcement happening in the first place. So there's that sort of safety education side of it. We bring the latest and greatest to our members from a human resources training standpoint. That area of law changes so quickly. And so we've got great member lawyers and specialists that are able to come in, consultants, and just keep people updated. When there's new drug testing options that pop up, we had that happen in 2023 with the advent of oral fluids testing becoming more relevant. We were able to get webinars out there essentially immediately, informing folks and answering questions on that. Same thing for, like a controversial topic like personal conveyance, where, nobody really knew what that meant whenever those rules and regs came out, but we were able to get, John McCormick from FMCSA in person to explain what it is and isn't, and, where can you be completely safe on something like that. And so that's kind of invaluable. And then the other thing, I think people join for, or at least they experience, is just the power of networking. And it's not something that's easy to write down and say, hey, this is the benefit that you'll get from networking. But, I don't think there's many new problems in trucking. And I say that carefully because there's new things that pop up, but everyone's made these mistakes before, right? Whether they're $1 billion company or small company, most of the mistakes have been made and the solutions are out there. And trucking companies are surprisingly generous, even with fleets that may technically be competitors, but maybe not competitors in all spaces, just in sharing ideas, collaborating, cross-pollinating. And it's amazing just getting, 20 or so fleets in a room talking about a safety topic. And you've got $1 billion companies representing the room, and you've got very tiny companies representing the room, and they're all learning from each other. The $1 billion folks are able to learn how an agile company is solving for something, and the small company is able to leverage the resources of what a $1 billion company did when they went through an RFP with, say, a new technology or new software, just really share ideas and save time and money, which is a beautiful thing in an industry that doesn't have the steepest margins.
Yeah, I was going to ask how involvement varies for the megas, the mid-sized fleets versus the small carriers. How they're engaging different? Is it about the same? What does that look like and what you see?
I would say, and I got to be careful about how I think about it, but I'd say some of our small to mid-sized fleets are the most active because I feel like it's that much more tangible to them and they're that closer to the bottom line, so to speak. And I don't mean that in a way that our megas aren't participating because they absolutely are. It's just, when you're $1 billion company, you can afford to make some more mistakes, say, than your smaller company or your mid-sized company where, the wrong investment in technology or hardware or something could be devastating, right? It's really hard to undo that. It's not as hard for a much larger company to be able to absorb a mistake, so to speak. And so I would say on average, our small to mid-sized fleets are a little bit more involved, but we've got great partnerships and there's so many different ways to participate where some of our largest fleets, they participate by just, sending a dues check and they'll send one person to a meeting every now and then. And that's what they feel like they've got time to do. And we, take those dues, those resources, and we implement them in the advocacy efforts. And that means that we have to rely more on our small to mid-sized fleets to show up for an advocacy day. We'll do that. And, whoever shows up and their story matters and it's important to get that across. And so I would say there's not really a one size fits all there. Everybody participates in some form or fashion. And what I love seeing is just being able to facilitate that idea sharing. So a member will come to me and say, hey, I've got a problem with, trying to start this business over at the port. Who do you know? And so I'm able to say, all right, well, I know these two companies are starting some drayage operations. Let me put you in touch with them. I don't know what they'll share, but I'm happy to facilitate a conversation. And just knowing that somebody else is an NCTA member or another state trucking association member, it's amazing how generous folks are to sharing ideas or common considerations to be thinking about before entering a new line of business.
Yeah. I think one thing we hear a lot with the small and mid-sized carriers is they're family-run operations, right? They're family-owned and operated. And so it's often a bit more personal too. And so how they engage, the reasons for why they're engaging are sometimes different. And not to say that it's better or worse, but it's just a different type of approach or kind of contact that you might have there. And the transfer of knowledge is obviously a big part of that. The last kind of nuts and bolts question I have for you here is the relationship between the state associations and American trucking associations. Folks are often hearing about it generally, but don't fully understand about how it works together. Could you shed some light on that for our audience who might be curious about how the state associations and the national organization work together?
Yeah, incredibly closely. So we talked about my staff size. I'm 5 full-time staff members. The American Trucking Association is 150 plus, right? So there's a big resource difference there where we all work together on common goals and initiatives. And so we're able to get white papers, research, model legislation, share ideas across state lines. Hey, Arkansas ran a towing bill and it didn't work because of this. How might you think about that whenever you're implementing it in North Carolina? What do you expect, to hear from the other side to be able to position yourself and make better advocacy arguments? And so it's really an impressively well-oiled machine in terms of just collaboration. We have a call every 2 weeks where the executives all get together and we have briefings on policy from the American Trucking Associations. We hit highlights, lowlights, and everything in between, kind of talk strategy on, what's going on in Congress, which, the secret is not a whole lot. But at least, what are we chipping away at over time? I try not to sound too jaded when I talk about that advocacy at the federal level because it's a slow moving machine. But we also just kind of get updates on, how are we able to work together as a federation to move the needle? One of those areas is judicial fairness or tort reform, however you want to call it, where there's some federal movement on that. But the reality is that's mostly going to have to be a state fight, right? That's going to be jurisdiction to jurisdiction on making the laws such that it's fair for all businesses, including trucking companies, to operate. And so ATA has done a great job of supporting folks at the state level, including even offering, financial dollars to support campaigns depending on what legislation is being pushed. And we're just seeing really kind of a watershed movement of success in that throughout those jurisdictions where states like Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, Texas, Indiana, they're all getting these wins in the space. And from the North Carolina perspective, they're kind of catching up to things that happened in North Carolina in 2011, where we've got a pretty good framework for defending yourself reasonably. And so some of these other states where there's more room for abuse are catching up and able to reform their state level law when it comes to accident defense. And it's fun to watch, right? And the momentum builds so quickly, and we all work together and collaborate and, cheerlead for each other when they get their wins and commiserate, when their losses, and get ready to fight again.
Awesome. Cool. Well, as we wrap up here, if anyone's feeling inspired to get more involved in their state level associations, what first step should a carrier take in North Carolina or in another state here?
Yeah, just reach out. I think, we're small staff, but we'll talk to anybody. And my goal at the end of the day is that if someone's going to write the NCTA a check, I want them to get that value back and forth, right? We're not interested in being a country club. We're not trying to get rich off of membership dues. We're looking to take those dollars and invest and hopefully give back more than you're putting in. And so for me, it's a matter of finding out, where can we support you, right? Is it providing a forum to celebrate your drivers and technicians in competition? We can handle that. Is it you've got this issue that you want reform and other fleets are seeing the same issue? We can kind of handle that. Are you a small fleet that maybe doesn't have a really robust safety or HR department? We can get you with resources to be able to augment and supplement for you to continue to stay lean while you're trying to operate and move freight by offering you with the best educational content that's specific to your industry. And so I think it's just a matter of having that exploratory call and figuring out, what your challenges are, what your pain points are, what's your level of interest. And I think we've got a robust buffet of areas where we can get you that value back on a pretty quick return, in my humble opinion. And, based off of the growth of our association and our ability to retain members, I think they're kind of seeing it as well. So it's just a matter of, raising your hand or reaching out and joining the momentum.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, Ben, thank you for joining me today. Great conversation as always. We'll talk soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Trucking Tomorrow. The show notes include links to any resources mentioned in today's show. And if you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe so you never miss an episode and leave us a 5-star review.
Truck base, you're always tough.